And welcome everybody. It's just wonderful to see your responses in the chat box where you're connecting in from today from all across the world. For those of you that are in warmer climates, I wish that I was with you today as it's a very cold and chilly day here on the MIT campus in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But glad that all of you can take some time out of your day to join us for today's webinar, Harnessing AI as an Ally, Inquiry, Insight, and Impact for Tomorrow. As you know, we try to bring these 60-minute innovation at work deep dives to you to really give you some very practical takeaway knowledge and information that you can use in your personal and professional lives right away. And just delighted to do that today with you with our senior lecturer, our MIT faculty member, Hal Gregersen. I've worked with Hal for a number of years here at MIT. It's been my honor and pleasure to work with him, launching several different programs in executive education that have really proven to be very successful and impactful in helping leaders navigate today's challenging business environment. Hal teaches regularly here in our programs. He's also been very involved with the MIT Leadership Center over the years. But beyond the work that he's done here at MIT, he's really had a lot of practical experience working with executives and top companies and global organizations from around the world. He truly brings a global perspective to all that he does inside and outside of the classroom. He's taught at several business schools, top business schools from around the world, and we're delighted to have him here with us at MIT Sloan in our executive education group. If you just Google Hal, you'll come up with lots of great videos on some of his talks and lectures that he's done. You may have read several of his wonderful books, from The Innovator's DNA that he co-authored with Clay Christensen, to some of his more recent books, Questions Are the Answers. One of the things that I've truly enjoyed in working with Hal over these years is his approach, learning about his approach to kind of human-centered leadership, really a very introspective approach. And what I'm so excited about today, I know Hal's been very busy researching AI, the impact that it has on leaders, on individuals, on organizations, and on society writ large. So really, I think we're going to have a very insightful discussion. Hal has a lot that he wants to share with you. We're going to talk about how you as a leader can engage with AI to ask better questions, to hone your discovery skills by implementing AI, and understanding the strategic implications of AI-driven change in our current and certainly our future roles. A reminder to please submit any questions that you have through the Q&A tab. We'll try to find time throughout the next hour to answer your questions. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but we'll do our best. So without any further delay, Hal, thank you for joining us. And why don't you tell us what's on your mind in terms of harnessing AI as an ally?
Well, first of all, Rob, gratitude for several things. One is for you and your enduring and deep support over the years in terms of working together on these different programs, without which some of them may have never seen the light of day. So thank you. And a huge thank you, as I've looked in the chat. I just think it's utterly amazing that a decade or two ago, we would not have seen such a range of people on a call like this, on a webinar like this, being able to do what we're doing the way we're doing it. And it's the beauty of the world we live in. I have hope, and my hope won't die, that good's going to come of all this. And that's my intention in terms of what we're trying to do today. FYI, that background is not fake. In fact, I was thinking about something, and this was not pre-planned, I promise you. But this is one of my favorite toys. It's called the Knapp Electric Questioner. It's from the early 1900s, and basically you open the box and you put some things in, and you have two electrodes. And if you get the question right, it rings a bell, and if it doesn't, you get a little shock, and it's really fun. But the point is, it's questions count, period. Inquiry is the source of leadership that makes an impact. And for 30 plus years, I've had a working definition of leadership that has served me well, and it may not it may not work for you, but it's worked well for me. And that's leadership is creating a space. Now, in today's world, it would be a psychologically safe space, but early on, it was just leadership is creating a space where inquiry leads to insight, and insight leads to impact. It's a learning cycle. And if those three things happen, people are engaged, problems get solved, progress gets made. And that's why we're using those three words here today, because they actually capture a lifetime of work with other colleagues and myself around those three elements. When I landed at MIT 12 years ago, I was stunned that this was a university, an institute, where they actually behaved like the innovative companies I'd been studying for a decade with Clay Christensen and Jeff Dyer. And we ended up at the Leadership Center, Deborah Ancona and I, studying what MIT leadership meant. And the bottom line is it's challenge-driven, problem-led. That's how we show up. So the starting point in a world full of AI is, what challenges am I showing up with as a leader in my team or organization? And have I incorporated well an understanding of AI and its implications in a very refined way for, again, my team and organization? And when I do that, people have a sense of transparency about why I'm there as a leader. That's what she or he or they care about. And so these kinds of leaders are not just from MIT, but one of them that is very in the news now is Jensen Huang, co-founder of NVIDIA and CEO there now. Basically, he said he can go throughout an entire day now, literally only asking questions. And part of the story there is he has over 60 direct reports. He has no regularly scheduled meetings. The only meetings he shows up at are the ones where they're trying to find and solve problems, trying to use inquiry to generate insight to make a big impact. And he will go to those meetings, he'll offer his questions, and literally that's his preferred role in trying to move NVIDIA forward as they try to make computers do what they're not intended to do in order to solve some of the world's biggest problems. That may sound like some kind of a marketing tagline, but it's actually the way they think, the way they work, the way they operate. So a couple of quotes worth sharing around this. Jensen Huang recently said, learning how to interact with AI is not unlike being someone who is really good at asking questions. One of his customers, Sam Altman, OpenAI, figuring out what questions to ask will be more important than figuring out the answer in the world of AI. Demis Hassabis, one of the hardest things is asking the system the right question. And so all of those things are the starting point from my perspective about how we can have clarity and hope in the midst of extreme uncertainty with all of the changes coming at us nonstop and will be coming for at least the next decade via AI and its implications. One of the courses that Rob and I have worked on is called Questions Are the Answer. And subtitle really should be something like a creative approach to enhanced AI, enhanced inquiry. The book Questions Are the Answer started initially with Clay Christensen, and then he had complications that arose before he passed away during COVID. Clay always asked profound questions, and they could be extremely simple. Every conversation I ever had with him, professionally or personally, two questions were asked. What are you wrestling with? How can I help? What a perfect challenge-driven leader who honestly cares about those questions and has a willingness to do something about them. Well, I interviewed 200 plus people, and including folks like Jeff Wilke, who used to be at He used to be at Amazon, was a CEO of Consumer Worldwide. Asked him, Jeff, how do you ask those sorts of great questions to move things forward? Now he's at Rebuild Manufacturing, trying to pull manufacturing forward in North America. He said, if you never ask questions, you never experience anything new, your mental model becomes stale. That sounds a lot like machine learning, deep learning, AI, which he is deeply embedded in and understands. And then he said, but if you seek out things you don't know, have the courage to be wrong, to be ignorant, to have to ask more questions and maybe be embarrassed socially. All of those things are often things we do not associate with leadership. And yet these leaders like him, they realize that's the core of leadership. If you do those things, then you'll build a more complete mental model and it will serve you well over the course of your life. That's interesting. So one of the questions, the deeper questions we explore in that course is, am I on an everyday basis being a little more wrong, being a little more surprised, being a little more uncomfortable, being a little more reflective and quiet? Because all of those little mores add up to better questions. Because when we're wrong, when we're uncomfortable, when we're reflectively quiet, we actually create the space for our mental model to be reshaped and a new question to surface. And with those conditions, in the course, we explore 3 or 4 tools that are really fascinating that you could do on your own, but please join us in a conversation with other people at some point. The first is a question journey, which is like thinking carefully about what is my relationship with inquiry? How did authority figures in my home, in my schools growing up, in my technical or university training, in my first professional role, in my first managerial role, and even in my current role, how do those authority figures respond to my tough, challenging, fearless questions that are trying to move problems forward? Interestingly, that journey has a big impact on our asking the best questions we can today. And there's another part that we're now adding into that journey, which is, what's your question journey with AI? Is it enhancing your questions or destroying them? Is it making them better or worse? And that leads to another tool we use in the course, which is a question audit, meaning not in the spirit of an authoritarian top-down audit being done by a group of accounting auditors, but an audit of ourselves, a reflective audit about, to what degree am I being wrong, uncomfortable, and quiet? To what degree and what kinds of questions am I using when I wander around the world of work and home? How am I incorporating AI into my question practice? Is AI causing me to ask more wrong, to be more wrong and uncomfortable and quiet? Is AI causing me to ask and increase the novelty and the quantity and the uniqueness to my questions, which we've done research that says if we engage well with AI, we actually do ask more questions, more varied questions, and more unique value-creating questions. There's more things that are embedded in that audit, but it's an interesting opportunity to step back, look at yourself for a day, and reflect on, what questions am I asking? What questions am I being asked? What are the patterns and what are the implications? And as I collect that sort of data, as you well know, AI is driven by data. I can analyze those things now in very unique ways to see how might I ask even better questions vis-a-vis that audit. The final piece is really an exploration of a process I discovered 20 years ago teaching a group of leaders, where we stopped in the middle of a stuck conversation about a problem we all cared about, and we asked nothing but questions for 15 minutes nonstop, no answers, no explanations about why we're asking. We had over 100 questions on the boards around the room. The energy level rose in the room. We reframed the challenge. We had ideas to potentially solve it. All of that in just 15 minutes of asking nothing but questions. Since then, I've used that methodology called the question burst, probably with 40 to 50,000 leaders around the world in companies everywhere on planet Earth. And regardless of cultural context, the question burst still works. And if you just stop, even for a couple of minutes alone, and set a timer and try to get 10 or 15 questions before your next tough conversation, you'll walk out of that in a better place. Now, the other part that's fascinating here is within this age of AI, we can do things with AI we could never do before, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. So what I sometimes do now with AI, among other things, we don't have time to go through an exhaustive list of them, but here's one of them. In the spirit of some research I'm doing with Renee Richardson-Gosling, who's in the human first area of the initiative on the digital economy here at MIT, we're writing a paper about how to keep humans first in the question burst process. So here's the first implication. Number one, if you've got a challenge, do not, I repeat, do not go to AI instantly and say, give me all the important questions I should ask about this challenge. Because if you do, over time, you will lose the ability to ask good questions. So keep the human first, take a few minutes, generate those questions yourself. Then what I do is input those questions, say to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever version you use. And then I say, here are 20 questions about this challenge, and this is the challenge. I would like to do a question burst that was created by Hal Gregersen with you. And when you use those words, question burst, Hal Gregersen, it will know exactly what you're talking about. And then what you can say to it is, I don't want you to be a sycophant and tell me questions you think are going to make me feel better. I want you to ask tough, challenging questions. I want you to be diverse and rich in the use of your questions. I want you to push and probe. And I want you to make sure we don't get stuck asking the same kinds of questions. Will you help me do that? Now, here's what we're going to do, ChatGPT. We're going to do a round robin approach where I ask a question, you ask a question. It slows down the process. So I ask a question, type it in. It asks one question back. I think about it. I ask another question. It asks a question back. I did this recently, and what I discovered at the end of that process, pooling all the questions, mine alone, the ones given to me by AI, almost half of the best questions actually came from AI. But I never have that experience, never have that experience if I simply ask AI to give me a bunch of questions about a challenge. So that's, for what it's worth, the kinds of things we're exploring in that program. Now, questions are always a means to an end. Always. They are not the end point. And so that leads to the next program that Rob and I developed, which was the Innovator's DNA, Mastering 5 Skills for Disruptive Innovation. It was over a decade ago with Clayton Christensen and Jeff Dyer. We interviewed 100 of the world's best leaders in the most innovative companies in a list we did with Forbes for about a decade about the most innovative companies in the world. In those 100 leaders we interviewed, people like Jeff Bezos, who was then early on with Amazon, Diane Green was a co-founder of VMware, more recently the chairman of MIT throughout the pandemic. Those kinds of people. There were 5 skills they used in order to find and solve problems more effectively. The first skill, the starting point, is questioning. They asked questions nonstop that challenged the status quo, that challenged their fundamental business models before it was too late. Then they didn't sit on their behinds in their offices. They got up, they got out, they got into the world, and they did what others might call design thinking skills, which is they observed like anthropologists to recognize patterns that otherwise they couldn't see. They got out and networked with people not to get career advancement, but to get bright, brilliant, new, provocative ideas from other people who were not like them. They also experimented and prototyped rapidly. And when they use those questions and they combine the questions with observation, networking, and/or experimenting, it's the combination in a regression analysis that tells us that's what leads to unique, valuable ideas, new businesses, new products, new services, new processes. We have 25,000 data points from a survey assessment that we use within the Innovators DNA program, where you basically get feedback about those skills and where do you fit against the best innovators in the world in order to become better at what you do as an innovator. But what we discovered was it's the combination, questions times observing, networking, experimenting, that leads to associational thoughts, connecting the dots, getting new novel ideas. Well, AI comes along. I just shared for a minute how questioning got amplified by AI. AI arguably is one of the most adept pattern recognizers on planet Earth. If we have good data, we can complement our primary human data with that AI-driven inquiry, analysis of the patterns we can't see. Or we could actually network with people we would never talk to, but would love to. And so I'm going to pull something up here as an example. And just, I want to get a couple of questions. So imagine you've got a challenge and you put the challenge into Claude or ChatGPT and you say, what are the 5 most important questions Jensen Huang, CEO of NVIDIA, might ask me about this challenge? It came back with, what are the fundamental assumptions behind your project? How can you break it down to first principles? Well, what about Lena Nair, the CEO of Chanel? How are you creating an inclusive environment that encourages every team member to contribute unique perspectives on this big project? I also asked it about Bluey, the cartoon character in the kids show from Australia. One of his best questions, that question was, when we're all sitting down with some bickies and tea, bickies or biscuits and tea after this, what story do we want to tell about how the project all turned out? And then I actually was fascinated by Mary Curie, one of the most amazing researchers. What legacy, she asked, do you want to leave? And how does that influence the daily choices you're making on this project? And then I actually was looking out the window. We live near the ocean and there's a big owl that lives on a tree. So I took some pictures of the owl, input the photos into ChatGPT, told it, this is the owl. What if that owl were asking me a question, or it was a hawk actually, not an owl, forgive me, it was a big hawk. And the question that came back was, how do you maintain poise and readiness even when your path ahead is clouded or unclear? Like, I can't talk to hawks or owls, I'm sorry, you're Bluey. But the fascinating thing with AI is I can diversify my network, get very different perspectives when I engage it that way. And the same could be said, obviously, with experimenting. Animators, as soon as these LLM models came out with images, it was just like, it saved them weeks of time. They had an idea about a new animation. They could do it instantly as opposed to draw it out and do it for a week. AlphaFold with biologists and biotech, enabling them to create things they could quickly that otherwise could never matter, and the list goes on. So that's what we're trying to explore in part in that Innovators DNA program. How do you build not just questioning, but the other innovation skills, collecting primary data as a human being and connecting that to secondary data that comes uniquely and creatively from AI as a resource? So, all of that was happening. And about 10 years ago, I met Ed Catmull. And if you've never read Creativity Inc., it's one of my top 5 books on creativity and innovation ever. He's incredibly thoughtful. I actually counted the number of questions he had in that book because I love questions, and every page literally had more than one question on it when you do the averages. It's full of questions and answers. But Ed is a deeply inquisitive guy, co-founder of Pixar, and I ended up meeting him at a dinner, and discovered that we had grown up 8 blocks apart from each other in Salt Lake City, Utah, when we were kids, but never crossed paths. And then we both had this love affair for the rest of our life with creativity, innovation, inquiry. Now, here's the short story on Toy Story. Ed's getting his PhD in the mid 1970s. His advisor tasks him with figuring out mathematically the 3D animation that would work on a computer screen like we're looking at. Now, at that point on planet Earth, there had been no 3D animations. Ed and somebody else cracked the code, created an image of his hand moving on the screen, and Ed loved art. He had wanted to be an animator at Disney, but wasn't quite good enough. And at that moment, it was a realization we could make someday a 90-minute full-length animated film made by computers. It's possible now. And then Ed got to work, literally, solving short-term problems, hardware, software, storytelling at places like Lucasfilms in the middle of all those initial Star Wars movies. He was building skills, building knowledge, making progress step by step. It all compounded. And Ed was acutely aware of Moore's law and the compounding technology and the fact that compute speed and power to cost was doubling down year after year. And he knew it was too expensive now to make that movie, but he had a prediction about 10 years into the future of how it could be done and when it could be done with that compounding change in computer technology. So he chose a big long-term commitment. He committed to it. He didn't just sit around thinking about the future, but got to work on solving short-term problems that delivered results for the second and third Star Wars movies. And then he ended up being bought out by Steve Jobs and founding Pixar. And 23 years later, from that first hand movement, he gets Toy Story with the collaboration of a lot of other people inside and outside of Pixar to make it work. So here's the short story of it. He saw rapid compound growth. I don't like the word exponential because it hides some important things. Compounding. Go listen to some talks by Jensen Huang. You will hear the word compounding frequently in his conversations. It happened when Ed and I were there last year for a day, working and visiting with him. It was very fascinating. Compounding was everywhere. So Ed knew, he saw rapid compound growth. That enabled him to sense the implications, even though they were still vague. He then solved these short-term problems as stepping stones to long-term vision. That long-term vision was not given to him by some boss or somebody else. He chose it. And he chose the tensions between short-term and long-term that came with it because he cared about making that movie. And then Ed is all about we, not me. And it was clear he could only make progress on this big challenge by doing it with other people inside and outside of Pixar. We call it a virtuous cycle. It's a positive cycle. And the opposite is exactly a death cycle where people don't see deeply into the technologies. They don't have a sense of the implications. They don't commit to long-term projects. They become even more short-term and opportunistic. And it's often I instead of we. And as a result, that company in a world of AI-driven change is being set up for ultimate failure, or team, or individual. And what Ed and I have realized is it's so important to have these truth-seeking mechanisms in today's world. Sinan Aral over at he's a co-director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy, has done literally decades of work around truth versus error or false news, kind of fact-seeking out there in the broader world. And he also brings it inside to the organization. And that's what's fascinating is that people like Ed Catmull and Jensen Huang and Lisa Su at AMD and Lena Nair at Chanel, all of them are they may not use these words, but they are all deeply committed to creating truth-seeking mechanisms so they can see things as they really are. They have to get beneath the surface. And there are really unique, powerful ways in which they do that. And so it's really intriguing that, they do it themselves. And so questioning, a question burst might be a truth-seeking mechanism. It might be walking through the plant or the factory or being with the people. It might be spending time with customers. It might be doing some of those discovery skill things we talked about from the innovator's DNA. We get out there to the point that we are wrong and uncomfortable and quiet, and that's how we discover the truth, and we discover new questions that help us push things forward. And so what Ed and I discovered was, number one, the story I actually told in the innovator's DNA about the rise and fall of Kodak was cute, simplistic, and really didn't capture the essence of the reality of what was happening there. And, if I could rewind and rewrite that, I would do it very differently. Because here's what we learned, in part through doing a deeper analysis of Kodak's demise from being one of the most revered and successful and profitable companies on planet Earth to going bankrupt. We also had a chance to talk to one of Ed's old high school classmates who was a key engineer at Kodak Chemical Engineering, to Mike Hawley, who used to be on the board of Kodak. I mean, fascinating people. And when we put all that data together, it's a very different story. So if you go back in time, I was critical of Kodak in my earlier version of the story because the executives just didn't get it when Steven Sasson created the first electronic camera in the 1970s. They didn't jump on it. Well, what I didn't really think through is what could they have jumped on then? And the reality is not much. It was in the 1970s. But here's a couple of data points that you may be aware of, but if you're not, they're really interesting. Not only did Steven Sasson do what Ed Catmull did, which was, here's Moore's law, here's how that translates into computing power to cost. Here are the implications of that for the sensors in these cameras. And in roughly 15 years to 18 years, we're going to hit this threshold point where the images from electronic cameras are probably going to be good enough to supplant the images we take with regular film. Now, he was a young engineer, and this is the part I didn't know. There was an entire white paper written by a group of other engineers and technologists at Kodak that basically summarized the same story. So it's not that Kodak's executives didn't know. And it's not that it was just some cute machine sitting on the wall that could take electronic photographs. Their engineering people were crystal clear about, here are the implications. Now, what none of them knew, nor could they conceive then, is that things like Instagram and other social media apps would completely transform the sharing of images to electronic from paper. And that is something I could not have expected them to thoughtfully consider back then. But here's what I could have invited them to do if I were to think through that story all over again. You've seen the data. You have relative confidence that in 15 to 18 years, this company is going to be bankrupt if they don't prepare for it. And what I would have also told them is the following. The average CEO tenure today, 2025, and it was longer back then, but not a whole lot. The average CEO tenure today is roughly 6 to 8 years, depending on the industry. The average C-suite leader's tenure reporting to that CEO is under 5 years. the average time it takes to figure out and then ultimately solve a big challenge like changing a business model is usually 7 to 10 years minimum, which means most senior teams are not long enough to see a long-term change that they care about come to fruition. And so, senior team at Kodak, you're going to have to figure out, how do you embed this future reality into your current actions so that you don't get sideswiped or run over in the next 15 to 18 years? And one of the key things you're going to have to do is, who's paying careful attention to those technology changes in your senior group? Who's starting to get the edges of what are the implications? And what are the truth-seeking mechanisms you've got in place that don't hide or dodge truth, but actually amplify it and get to it? And so what we realized was that the fundamental challenge for leaders today, especially in a world of AI, come back from the Kodak situation where they literally went bankrupt, even though they tried and they were a leader of the creation of electronic cameras and so on. They could not make the shift. And part of my argument would be it's because they couldn't see to how to see reality deeply with these truth-seeking mechanisms and how to do something about it by literally saying, there are compounding technologies and learning going on here. They have deep implications for who we are. They are inevitably coming, and saying they're not won't change the reality. They have serious implications for our business model. And for what it's worth, the AI world we're living in and walking into will change every organization's business model in the next decade, including MIT's. They didn't step back to think, what are the short-term things we work on now to get ready for that future and make it happen? And as a result, if we don't consider those things and do something about it, we're in either a death cycle or a virtuous positive cycle. There's no neutral ground here. And the future won't wait for us to catch up. And this is where I love this quote by C.S. Lewis that recently came across my screen. Quote, "Good and evil increase at compound interest." Even a writer, C.S. Lewis, grasped the implications of compounding. Then C.S. Lewis said, that's why, I'll start over. Good and evil increase at compound interest. That's why the little decisions we make every day are of infinite importance. The smallest good act today is the capture of a strategic point from which a few months later, you may go on to victories you never dreamed of. So, those small failures to see today can become fatal mistakes tomorrow, and the smallest investment to see more deeply today can lead to big possible victories tomorrow. So which cycle are you building, and what are the implications for you? And that leads to the final course before I shut up, which is my early research 25, 30 years ago and the books over on that side are all about it. Global explorers, global assignments. It was when companies were going global and sending peoples to new countries and bringing them back home afterwards with disastrous results where people would leave, they would be disasters when they were in a new country. International assignments was the core. And there was an adjustment curve where people went to a new country. In the first 2 or 3 months, there was a honeymoon moment. Everything was cool because they didn't know what they didn't know. And then as they finally realized how incompetent they were, it's a bad sort of world where it's often a negative emotional place. It's a realization that my skills don't matter here. My roles are shifting. My identity is changing. And then if they choose to stay instead of leave, as they walk and wander through that steep learning curve coming out of the hole, it's like, okay, what skills do I acquire? What roles do I change and shift into? What are the implications for this of who I become? And then maybe after 3 or 4 years, they finish an assignment and possibly go back to their home country where it all happens again for another 3 to 5 year cycle. And the reality is, even if we're not on international assignments, there's a great book right over there by Bruce Feiler called Life is in the Transitions. In his study of 200 plus people, here's what he concluded. The average transition length in most of our lives is about 5 years from start to finish. It's a curve. And on average, as human beings, we go through a major transition at least every 5 years. So the net is we're always in transition. And all of that is amplified with AI, where, as you well know, AI is causing us to think through what skills am I going to keep and what skills am I going to let go as I engage with AI at work. These are deep implications. Eric Benjolson, McAfee, others, they've got really interesting ways of researching and thinking about these skills and jobs and roles and what do you give to AI and what do you don't. And this is the starting point. With AI, it's a step back with a very consistent framework of 3 or 4 elements, which are what are the skills you want to give away to AI and what are the ones you want to keep? And what are the ones you want to enhance? Now, for me, questioning is one I want to keep, and I want to enhance it with AI. There are some routine skills like summarizing data that I could easily give away to AI. So what are the skills you're letting go of? What are skills you're taking on? This has deep implications for the roles you have, like coder, as you well know, may no longer be a role in the future. What are the roles you're letting go and taking on? And all of that bundles up to who am I? It's like, what's my identity? What do I stand for when I show up when part of my stuff is done by this agentic AI and part of it's done by me? Who am I? And what's meaningful to me in that kind of world? And as we're going through all of these things with huge levels of uncertainty, our emotional energy is going, woo, because it is hard. It's hard for me, and I'm not going to be a liar about it. This is a hard transition for me as well. I'm doing what we're talking about right now. We're literally in the process of revising all of the course descriptions, marketing course descriptions online for all 4 of these courses that I'm talking about. And last week, part of the revisions was engaging with AI because it can do some things and not others. And I certainly don't want them to feel like they've been popped out of AI. But as I engaged with that technology, it's like, this can be overwhelming because it can easily create 200 pages of documents. It's like, how am I going to do this differently and better? These are skill, role, and identity issues. And at one point, I was so frustrated that I was ready to give up. And I had to step back emotionally, reset, recalibrate, and come back with a different approach to make it work better. By the way, they're going to come up in the next day or two, the new ones, that amplify and focus on the AI as we're talking about. But what I'm trying to say is we're all in this together. And what I've realized is when we don't step back as individuals, teams, and even organizations and take a very fine-grained look at those 4 elements, skills, roles, identity, what we're letting go of, what we're taking on, we may well look back 5 years from now and become someone we didn't want to be and be working in a role that we're not the best at with skills that really aren't us. And my intent with that course, our intent with that course is basically, how can we be proactive instead of reactive? So I've got over here, just 1 second. It's a fun example. Give me 2 seconds. And I'm almost done, Rob, I promise.
Good. I've got some questions for you, Hal.
Okay, I'm almost done. Then we're gonna, here we go. Here's the So this is a Garmin navigation system. I used to use paper maps, and my mind was really good at memorizing a map when I landed in a new city. Then I got this screwy thing that you put on the windshield. Then later on, you've got the phone with Google Maps. And then 3 months ago, I'm driving in a neighborhood 3 miles away from my house. It's dark, my phone dies, and I have no idea where I am and how to get out and where to go. And that's when I realized I had given away my navigational skill set to this technology, and I'm not comfortable with that anymore. So I now intentionally drive without it in order to regain some of those skills because they're important to me. And I could say the same thing for every skill we are all looking at right now as we engage with AI. And taking that day or two or coming to the program on navigating transitions is a powerful time to systematically step back and look at all these layers of change so that we can decide this is what I want to be when I grow up instead of get surprised down the road. So, Rob, shoot away. I'm with you. I'm sorry for
Well,
that.
thank you, Cal.
It's just like there was so much today, and I know you've got so many comments and so many thoughts, and I'm really excited to read it all later. And I apologize for not doing it now, but I'm here. Rob, go for it.
No apology necessary, Hal. It's been wonderful to hear how this is impacting all your programs, everything that you're teaching here at MIT Sloan, and your commitment to really making sure that what you're teaching in the classrooms and online is up to date and relevant. So thank you for that. And thank you for leading us through how that's impacted you and your work here at MIT. A couple of the questions that have come in are around, and I'll kind of bundle some of them somewhat,
Thank
but
you.
the limitations of AI and concerns around guardrails and how should people approach building guardrails? One question from Brandon Hegel: have you trained any custom GPT or other LLM to run your question burst process with guardrails? And if so, would you share that? But even kind of from a wider arc, we've heard about limitations on AI, hallucinations, bad outputs. So what are your thoughts on guardrails and the limitations of AI where we are at present day, acknowledging that it's always improving?
Here's I'll start at the individual level. I'll start at the macro level and come back to the individual. At the macro level, those guardrails matter. In fact, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to be presenting some of this work at Microsoft with 1,000 of their top leaders, where they are caring deeply about how do we build those guardrails into the system. It matters in those organizations, and I am wholeheartedly behind that sort of logic. It's super, super crucial at the broader institutional structural level. As they do that up there, here's what I do down here local with myself. Obviously, I'm very careful about personal or problematic information going into any of these systems. I tend to rely on some of them that appear, like in ChatGPT, you can actually check to be in the not learning box where they're not using your stuff for learning models in the future. And it might have a more private element in that public space by checking that box. And ideally, I'd be within an MIT system, for example, where it's kept within this space instead of pushed back out there. And so I'm very aware of that. And when I do these questions bursts with it and so on, I'm wise and careful about privacy in terms of individual names or company names or those kinds of things so that it would never get out there. But that's my way of trying to manage that because I don't fully trust the broader system. I manage it at the micro level and hope that they will do the same out there. Does that help, Rob?
Yeah, I think it does for sure.
Yeah.
One other thing, I know that in your classes
Oh,
previously in your go
one
ahead.
last thing, Rob, sorry, is Sid Morampundi, who is an MIT researcher who was in the questions or the answer program, he actually did what you described. And it's really fascinating. He trained an LLM model, a private one within his system, to look at two dimensions around questions, very concrete to very abstract, and very immediate to very long-term horizon. And you can drop a question right in the middle of that. It's a 2, 4, 5, 5 by 5 matrix. So the question that prompted him to do that was a question burst I did where somebody at the end of it asked himself, am I a good father? He was thinking about his relationship with his teenage daughter, and he was asking himself, am I a good father? And Sid dropped, am I a good father, into that 5 by 5, and automatically it populated out with immediate concrete. What specific thing can I do today to connect with my daughter? And very abstract, long horizon. What legacy of fatherhood do I want to leave for my daughter? I think it's fascinating what could be done and is being done on that dimension. So thanks for the question.
You're very welcome. Thinking back to time we've spent together in the classroom, I remember you teaching about how difficult it was for senior leaders to sometimes find the truth. That the higher you go in the organization, the more challenging it can be to get people to speak truthfully to you, or not filter their information in some way.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about this earlier in our webinar today, but how can leaders use AI to help counter that trend in organizations?
Well, the spirit of that, Rob, is from people like Walt Bettinger, who was the CEO and chairman of Charles Schwab, and Narayana Murthy, who was the founder of Infosys. They both basically said, as soon as they became managers, they realized people were telling them what they thought they wanted them to hear, and not telling them what they thought they didn't want to hear. And the higher they got, the worse that got. And that was pre-AI. And so now we're in a world where all of those historical dynamics of truth dodging at the higher level are still in place. But they're amplified, from my perspective, by a proliferation of information that can easily amplify the truth dodging mechanisms. And so the alternative is, what am I doing as a leader at a fundamental level to, first of all, set up those truth-seeking, not dodging mechanisms, make sure they're working, and enable them to somehow sort through truth versus error in this information coming in, and as when possible, use those AI-related mechanisms to hunt for information I otherwise wouldn't get. And that's where my historical bias has been primary data trumps secondary data. Primary data, you use secondary to complement primary personal information you've received by getting out there and observing and networking and experimenting and so on yourself. Complement that with the secondary kind of data. AI is often perceived as that secondary data. And I'm realizing that what we can do is use those tools, again, to surface information about problems and see those problems, be they human resource or online machining production problems, see them before we could normally see. And so I think the best of the best leaders, like the Jeff Wilkes of the world and the Lisa Sues, I believe they actually have had historically those truth-seeking mechanisms in place. And they are now using these AI tools to amplify their ability to see deeply, to see reality before it's too late, in ways that others aren't, because they already have the habit of looking for the truth. Matt Dwyer, now I've been talking about tech companies, but Patagonia is not really a tech company. But Matt Dwyer is responsible for truth-seeking at Patagonia and innovation there in materials. And he actually calls his team members truth seekers. Because when they're trying to find out if a supply chain is clean, they want to know, is it really clean? And they can use now AI to complement their human seeing ability to determine is or is not that supply chain genuinely 100% this kind of cotton, for example. It's fascinating to watch them use these technologies to do their work at Patagonia.
Absolutely. We have just a few minutes left. I'd like to ask Elaine and Charlotte if they could bring up the slides. I know you have some programs that are coming up, and hopefully everybody that's joined us today has found the content and the discussion useful. If you want to spend more time, dig more deeply into these topics, work more closely with Hal, I'd encourage you to look at the programs and the dates here on the slide that we're sharing. You can scan the QR code for more information. These three programs that we're displaying here are live online. So I know we've attracted a global audience today. You certainly can participate in this learning experience with Hal without having to travel here to MIT during this cold time of year here in Cambridge. So I hope that's of interest to many of you and you'll seek more information and possibly join us. But Hal, my final question for you, I've heard several times from different people here on campus and in the business community that we're kind of at a point in history similar to where we were in the early 1990s with the internet coming online. It was there, people knew it, people were starting to access it in different ways, but it wasn't widely adopted. And I feel like that there's truth to that we're kind of at a similar inflection point with AI. Clearly, the uptake rate is gaining, more and more people are using it. But your final thoughts, what advice would you have for somebody joining us today that hasn't used ChatGPT, that hasn't used AI? How do they get started?
My final advice would be prefaced with the following. I honestly do not believe what we're in the middle of is like that 1990s internet change you talked about. I believe it is that kind of change magnified somewhere between 100 to 1,000,000 times stronger and different. And the way I think about that is, it's like imagine if me trying to imagine you, Rob, showing up to work tomorrow 100 times better than you are today. You're already really good. I can't get my head around what that even looks like for you to be 100 times better tomorrow. These are orders of magnitude that we're in the middle of that are profound. And so the change is not like anything ever before. And I know you've heard that, and I've heard it, but it is different. That compounding and combining effect is profound and will be for at least a decade or two ahead of us. We're at the start point. The second thing is, if I've not engaged with it, my suggestion is to do what MIT graduate, now Warden Ethan Mollick suggests, which is have a problem, have an issue, spend 10 hours this week just talking with it about your challenge. And it's a powerful starting point to figure out, oh, this actually is a conversational supporter potentially of what I'm doing. And if I'm smart, it won't just be a sycophant, but it will help me to make progress on the challenges I care about. I'd like to share one quote related to the challenge piece, Rob, because I think it's really important in the context of what we're all living through. I ran across this literally yesterday. It's by Alan Watts, who does some amazing writing and thinking. Here's what he said. Problems that remain persistently insoluble should always be suspected as questions asked in the wrong way. We have been, are, especially now, and will be confronting problems and challenges we never have before in our lives with this AI coming into our world. They will remain persistently insoluble if we don't start changing our questions we're asking ourselves and others to make a positive impact in a world that needs that hope and optimism when things sometimes feel like they're going the other direction. And that's why these things matter to us, I think, at MIT. And that's why we're putting the energy in to trying to make that kind of difference.
Absolutely. And we're just past the top of the hour. I think that's a very compelling place to leave it for today. For those of you joining us, thank you for your time. I really do hope that you're taking away some practical insight that you can put to use, whether it's in one of our upcoming webinars or one of our programs here on campus or online. We certainly hope to see you again to continue your learning journey. Hal, I want to thank you not just for your time today, but also for the effort that you've made to really upgrade or refresh your portfolio of programs here, your commitment to making your teaching, evergreen and kind of always impactful. So appreciate all that you do. And again, always a pleasure to connect with you. Thanks, everybody. We hope to see you back in the MIT community again soon.